The flight before the storm. The first light of dawn crept through the window, casting a soft glow over the quiet bedroom. The alarm buzzed sharply, breaking the stillness. Captain Thomas Carter, a seasoned airline pilot, reached over to silence it, careful not to wake his wife, Alicia, who murmured softly in her sleep. For Thomas, this ritual was as familiar as the steady hum of a jet engine at cruising altitude. He had flown thousands of flights over his 20-year career, each one a balance of precision, professionalism, and the passion that first drew him to the skies. He swung his legs out of bed, his feet meeting the cool hardwood floor. The bathroom mirror reflected back a face etched with experience, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed and his hazel eyes sharp but kind. The uniform hung ready on the door, a testament to the discipline and respect the job required. Each brass button gleamed in the morning light, a reminder of the countless hours of training and sacrifice that brought him here. Downstairs, the coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with its warm aroma. Thomas poured himself a cup, savoring the first sip as he reviewed the day's schedule on his tablet. His co-pilot for today's flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles was a name he didn't immediately recognize: First Officer Jackson Bryant. Curious, Thomas scrolled through the roster, noting that Jackson was relatively new to the airline, but came with high praise for his skill and professionalism. Thomas didn't dwell on it long. Every flight was a team effort, and he trusted his crew to perform their roles with the same dedication he brought to his. He grabbed his flight bag, double-checking its contents: charts, checklist, a spare pair of glasses, and a small framed photo of his family. His son, Matthew, had slipped a note into the bag the night before. "Fly safe, Dad. See you tonight." The words brought a smile to Thomas's face. The drive to the airport was uneventful, the early morning streets quiet except for the occasional delivery truck or jogger. Thomas tuned the radio to his favorite jazz station, the smooth melodies helping him mentally prepare for the day ahead. Flying was second nature to him, but he never treated it as routine. Each flight carried hundreds of lives, and he approached every one with the gravity it deserved. At the airport, the employee parking lot was already filling up. Thomas greeted the security guard at the entrance, a friendly man named Victor, who had been working the gate for as long as Thomas could remember. "Morning, Captain Carter," Victor said with a smile. "Clear skies today." "Clear skies and a full flight," Thomas replied, tipping his cap as he walked toward the terminal. Inside, the terminal buzzed with activity. Passengers hurried to their gates, rolling suitcases clicking against the tile floor. The aroma of fresh bagels and coffee from the nearby cafe mingled with the faint smell of jet fuel wafting from the tarmac. Thomas moved through the crowds with purpose, his uniform commanding respectful nods and the occasional smile. The crew lounge was a hive of pre-flight activity. Flight attendants gathered around the coffee machine, swapping stories about memorable passengers, while pilots reviewed weather reports and flight plans. Thomas spotted a few familiar faces, exchanging brief greetings before heading to the operations desk to collect the latest updates on his flight. "Morning, Monica," Thomas said as he approached the operations manager, a meticulous woman who always had her paperwork in perfect order. "Good morning, Captain," Monica replied, handing him the flight manifest and weather reports. "Looks like smooth sailing to LA today. Just a bit of turbulence expected over the Rockies." Thomas nodded as he reviewed the documents, his practiced eyes scanning for any anomalies. Everything looked standard. No maintenance issues, a full passenger load, and favorable winds. Satisfied, he thanked Monica and headed toward the gate. The walk to the aircraft was always a moment of quiet reflection for Thomas. Each step brought him closer to the sky, a place that had always felt more like home than the ground. The terminal's bright lights gave way to the soft, natural light filtering through the large windows overlooking the tarmac. He could see the sleek body of the plane waiting at the gate, its engines gleaming in the morning sun. Thomas arrived at the gate area early, as was his habit. He introduced himself to the ground crew and reviewed the boarding process with Jenny, the gate agent. Passengers were beginning to gather, their expressions a mix of anticipation and weariness. Among them were business travelers with polished briefcases, families juggling strollers and snacks, and a group of high school students on a field trip. Jenny handed Thomas the passenger list, pointing out a few special cases, a couple of unaccompanied minors, a wheelchair assist, and a nervous first-time flyer who had already asked about turbulence multiple times. "We'll keep an eye on them," Thomas assured her, his voice calm and reassuring. As he made his way to the aircraft, Thomas spotted his co-pilot, First Officer Jackson Bryant, standing near the jet bridge. Jackson was tall, with dark skin and a confident posture that immediately impressed Thomas. He extended his hand with a warm smile. "First Officer Bryant, I presume," Thomas said, his tone light. "Yes, Captain Carter," Jackson replied, shaking his hand firmly. "It's a pleasure to fly with you today." "The pleasure's mine," Thomas said, genuinely. "Let's make it a good one." They boarded the plane together, Jackson carrying his flight bag with a steady hand. Inside the cockpit, the familiar environment welcomed them. The controls, dials, and displays felt like old friends, each one playing a critical role in the dance of flight. Jackson stowed his bag and began reviewing the pre-flight checklist with the practiced efficiency of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. As they worked through the preparations, Thomas observed Jackson's attention to detail and professionalism. It was clear that Jackson was not only skilled, but also deeply committed to his role. Thomas appreciated that. It wasn't just about technical ability. It was about the attitude you brought to the job. The flight attendants began boarding the passengers, their voices cheerful as they greeted each traveler. Jackson stepped out briefly to introduce himself to the cabin crew, a gesture Thomas respected. Building rapport with the team was an essential part of ensuring a smooth flight. Back in the cockpit, Thomas and Jackson continued their preparations, discussing the flight plan, weather conditions, and any potential challenges. Their conversation flowed easily, a sign of good chemistry between the two pilots. Thomas felt confident that this would be a routine flight, safe, efficient, and uneventful. But as the last passengers settled into their seats and the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, a minor incident occurred that set the tone for the unexpected events to come. A middle-aged passenger in first class had mistaken Jackson for a flight attendant and asked for help with his bag. Jackson, ever professional, politely corrected the man and assisted him anyway, earning an awkward apology. Thomas caught the exchange from the cockpit doorway, his expression tightening slightly. He had seen moments like this before, subtle reminders of the biases that still lingered in the world of aviation. But Jackson handled it with grace, and Thomas admired his poise. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its taxi to the runway. Thomas glanced at Jackson, who gave him a confident nod. Despite the earlier incident, their focus remained unwavering. They were pilots, professionals, and a team, ready to take to the skies and ensure every passenger reached their destination safely. Neither of them knew that the flight ahead would be anything but routine, and that their professionalism and character would soon be tested in ways they could never have anticipated. A turbulent encounter. As the plane roared down the runway and lifted into the skies, Captain Thomas Carter kept his eyes on the instrument panel, ensuring a smooth ascent. Beside him, First Officer Jackson Bryant mirrored his focus, adjusting throttle settings and monitoring the aircraft's climb. The cockpit hummed with the synchronized precision of two seasoned professionals, a symphony of clicks and affirmations that marked the heartbeat of a successful takeoff. "Positive rate of climb," Jackson announced, his voice calm and steady. "Gear up," Thomas replied, his hands firm on the controls as the plane surged higher into the morning sky. The familiar rhythm of their teamwork continued, a seamless interplay that spoke to their shared commitment to excellence. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinging off to signal passengers they were free to move about the cabin. The first leg of their journey from Atlanta to Los Angeles was well underway, and the skies ahead appeared as clear as promised. Thomas leaned back slightly, his grip on the controls easing, though his mind remained sharp. Years of experience had taught him never to let his guard down, even on the calmest of flights. "Smooth so far," Jackson said, glancing out the cockpit window at the endless expanse of blue. "Let's hope it stays that way," Thomas replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. He appreciated Jackson's quiet confidence, a trait that was essential in their line of work. As they settled into the cruise phase, the cockpit fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional exchange of information and adjustments to the autopilot. Thomas used the time to observe Jackson more closely, noting his meticulous attention to detail and the ease with which he handled his responsibilities. It was clear Jackson had earned his seat in the cockpit, not just through skill, but through the kind of discipline and dedication that set great pilots apart from the merely good. Their tranquility was interrupted by a crackling voice over the intercom. It was Sarah, the lead flight attendant, her tone professional, but carrying a note of urgency. "Captain, could you step into the cabin for a moment? We have a situation that requires your attention." Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Jackson, who nodded. "I'll keep things steady here," Jackson said, his hands already moving to take full control of the cockpit. "Thanks," Thomas replied, unbuckling his harness and making his way toward the door. As he stepped into the aisle, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The passengers, who moments ago had been engrossed in their books, movies, or quiet conversations, now wore expressions of unease. Whispers rippled through the cabin like a low hum, and all eyes seemed to dart toward one particular seat in the front of the plane. Sarah met him near the galley, her usually composed face shadowed with concern. "It's a passenger in first class," she began, her voice low. "He's being disruptive, questioning why Jackson is in the cockpit." Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach, though he kept his face impassive. "What's his reasoning?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering to the cabin. "He's questioning Jackson's qualifications. Loudly, it's making some of the other passengers uncomfortable." Thomas sighed. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered a situation like this, though it never got any easier. He glanced toward the passenger in question, a man in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive suit, his face flushed with indignation. Thomas recognized the type immediately, someone who equated authority with appearance, whose biases simmered just below the surface until something, or someone, brought them boiling over. "I'll handle it," Thomas said, squaring his shoulders as he approached the man. He kept his expression neutral, his voice calm but firm. "Good morning, sir," Thomas began, his tone professional. "I understand you have some concerns." The man turned toward him, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. "You're the captain, aren't you? I just want to know why your co-pilot looks inexperienced." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his patience thinning but his professionalism intact. "First Officer Bryant is a fully qualified pilot with extensive training and experience. He's here because he's earned his position, just like every member of this crew." The man scoffed, his voice rising loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Look, I'm not trying to cause a scene, but don't you think some of us deserve to know who's responsible for our safety? We pay a premium to fly first class, after all." A murmur of discontent rippled through the surrounding passengers, many of whom were visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding exchange. Thomas caught sight of a woman a few rows back, shaking her head in disapproval, while a younger man across the aisle frowned deeply, his fingers tapping on the armrest. Thomas leaned in slightly, his voice firm but quiet enough to avoid escalating the situation further. "Sir, I assure you, the qualifications of my co-pilot are not up for debate. If you have any further concerns, I suggest you address them after the flight with customer service." The man's face reddened further, but he seemed to sense he was losing support from the other passengers. With a huff, he sank back into his seat, muttering something under his breath that Thomas chose to ignore. He turned back towards Sarah, who gave him a small nod of approval, her posture relaxing slightly now that the confrontation had been diffused. As Thomas made his way back toward the cockpit, he couldn't help but feel a lingering frustration. He prided himself on fostering a professional and respectful environment, and incidents like these were a stark reminder of the challenges that still remained, not just in aviation but in the world at large. When he returned to the cockpit, Jackson glanced up from the controls, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay out there?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Just a minor issue," Thomas replied, settling back into his seat. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "A passenger had questions about your role." Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted a few settings on the autopilot, his movements precise. "I appreciate you handling it," he said finally, his voice steady. Thomas nodded, deciding not to press further. He could tell Jackson was used to this kind of scrutiny, though that didn't make it any less frustrating or unjust. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but the atmosphere in the cockpit was noticeably more subdued. Thomas and Jackson continued their work with the same professionalism as always, but the earlier encounter lingered like a shadow in the back of Thomas's mind. When the plane finally touched down in Los Angeles, the passengers erupted into polite applause, a routine gesture of appreciation. As Thomas and Jackson guided the aircraft to the gate and began their post-flight checks, Thomas felt a renewed sense of respect for his co-pilot. Jackson had handled the situation with dignity, his focus never wavering from the task at hand. As they disembarked, Jackson thanked Thomas for the smooth flight. "It's always a pleasure working with someone who values professionalism over appearances," he said, his tone warm but measured. Thomas smiled, clapping Jackson on the shoulder. "Likewise, and for what it's worth, you've got my full respect, not just as a pilot but as a person." Jackson's expression softened, a flicker of gratitude passing across his face. "That means a lot, Captain. Thank you." As they parted ways, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. He knew the challenges Jackson faced were part of a larger battle, one that required allies willing to stand alongside him. And in that moment, Thomas resolved to be one of them. For now, though, there was another flight to prepare for, another journey to undertake. The skies waited, and so did the work of making them a place where everyone could rise equally. Unbeknownst to both of them, this flight would ignite something far greater than either of them could have imagined, a spark of conversation that would ripple far beyond the confines of the cabin. Whispers at 35,000 feet. The Los Angeles tarmac shimmered under the midday sun, and the first leg of the journey had ended without further incident. Captain Thomas Carter and First Officer Jackson Bryant stepped off the jet bridge and into the terminal, exchanging polite nods with the ground crew. The brief layover gave them just enough time to refuel the plane, grab a quick bite, and prepare for their next leg, a return flight to Atlanta. Jackson carried himself with the same quiet confidence he'd exhibited during the flight, but Thomas noticed the subtle tension in his co-pilot's posture. The incident with the passenger had clearly affected him, though Jackson had done an admirable job of keeping his composure. As they entered the crew lounge, a few other pilots and flight attendants greeted Thomas warmly, some offering Jackson polite nods. While Jackson returned the greetings, Thomas couldn't help but notice the occasional flicker of hesitation in the way some people regarded him. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was a noticeable pause in their reactions, as though they were reevaluating their assumptions in real time. "You want to grab some coffee before we head back?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence between them. "Sure," Jackson replied, his voice even. "Could use a pick-me-up." The coffee station was tucked into a corner of the lounge, where a handful of crew members milled about, discussing weather patterns and passenger anecdotes. Thomas poured himself a cup of black coffee while Jackson opted for tea, his movements precise and deliberate. As they sipped their drinks, a senior pilot named Captain Briggs approached. Briggs was a towering figure with a booming voice and a reputation for being both charismatic and blunt. "Thomas, good to see you," Briggs said, clapping him on the shoulder before turning his gaze to Jackson. "And you must be Bryant. Heard you're flying with Carter today." "That's right," Jackson replied, meeting Briggs's gaze steadily. "Well, Carter's one of the best," Briggs said, his tone jovial but carrying an undercurrent of scrutiny. "You'll learn a lot from him." Thomas bristled at the implication that Jackson was there to learn rather than contribute. "Bryant's already a top-notch pilot," he interjected, his tone firm. "I'm lucky to have him on my crew." Briggs raised an eyebrow, his grin faltering slightly. Of course," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just making conversation." As Briggs wandered off, Thomas caught Jackson's subtle shake of the head, a gesture that spoke volumes. "People mean well," Jackson said quietly, his tone devoid of bitterness, but tinged with weariness. Most of the time, Thomas wanted to say something, to offer reassurance or solidarity, but he knew words would only go so far. Instead, he resolved to let his actions speak for themselves. The return flight began smoothly, the plane gliding into the sky with the practiced ease of a well-oiled machine. Jackson handled the takeoff, his hand steady on the controls as he guided the aircraft upward through layers of clouds. Thomas monitored the instruments, offering occasional affirmations but letting Jackson take the lead. "You've got a good touch," Thomas said as they leveled off at cruising altitude. "Ever considered going for captain?" Jackson smiled faintly. "Eventually," he said, "but I've got time. For now, I'm focused on being the best first officer I can be." Thomas nodded, impressed by the younger pilot's humility and dedication. "When you're ready, you'll make a damn good captain," he said. The cockpit fell into a comfortable rhythm as they settled into the cruise phase. But as they crossed over the Rockies, the tranquility of the flight began to unravel. It started subtly, an unusual delay in the cabin intercom's usual updates from the flight attendants. Thomas didn't think much of it at first, assuming Sarah and her team were busy with their routines. But then Maria's voice crackled over the intercom, her tone betraying a note of unease. "Captain, could you step into the cabin for a moment? There's something you should see." Thomas glanced at Jackson, who nodded. "I've got this," Jackson said, taking control of the aircraft. Thomas unbuckled and made his way into the cabin, where the atmosphere was noticeably tenser than it had been earlier. Passengers were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward a cluster of seats near the front. Sarah met Thomas near the galley, her expression tight. "What's going on?" Thomas asked. Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the first-class section. "It's the same passenger from earlier," she said. "He's been talking to other passengers, and now, well, things are escalating." Thomas followed her gaze to see the man in the expensive suit standing in the aisle, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to a small group of passengers. "I'm just saying," the man was saying loudly, "we deserve to know who's flying this plane. This isn't about politics, it's about safety." Several passengers were nodding along, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. Others were clearly uncomfortable, their eyes darting toward Thomas as he approached. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the murmur. The man turned, his expression hardening as he recognized the captain. "Is there a problem?" The man crossed his arms, his stance defiant. "I think we all have a right to know if the crew is qualified to handle this flight," he said. "This isn't personal. It's about accountability." Thomas felt a surge of anger, but kept his expression neutral. "I can assure you," he said evenly, "that every member of this crew is fully qualified and committed to your safety. First Officer Bryant has undergone rigorous training and has more than enough experience to handle this flight." The man scoffed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Sure. And we're just supposed to take your word for it." Before Thomas could respond, a woman seated nearby spoke up. "Why don't you sit down and let them do their jobs?" she said, her voice sharp. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." The man's face reddened, but he seemed unwilling to back down. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said, addressing the surrounding passengers. "I'm just saying we should hold people accountable. And what exactly do you think you're holding them accountable for? Another passenger interjected, her tone icy. The only thing you're doing is showing your ignorance. The murmurs grew louder as more passengers chimed in, some defending the crew while others expressed uncertainty. Thomas took a deep breath, stepping forward to address the group. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this flight is under my command, and I take full responsibility for the safety and well-being of everyone on board. If you have concerns, I encourage you to address them after the flight. For now, I ask that you remain seated and allow us to do our jobs." The man in the suit opened his mouth as if to argue but seemed to think better of it. With a huff, he sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. Thomas nodded to Sarah, who began moving through the cabin, offering reassurances to the other passengers. As Thomas made his way back to the cockpit, he felt the weight of the incident pressing on him. This wasn't just about one passenger's ignorance. It was a reflection of larger issues that couldn't be ignored. When he stepped into the cockpit, Jackson glanced at him, his expression questioning. "Everything okay out there?" Jackson asked. "Handled it," Thomas replied, though the tension in his voice hinted at the effort it had taken. "Let's just focus on getting everyone home safely." Jackson nodded, his hand steady on the controls. "Roger that, Captain." As the plane continued its journey eastward, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was becoming more than just another routine trip. It was a test, not just of their skills as pilots, but of their resolve as individuals navigating a world still struggling with its own turbulence. And though the skies ahead were clear, the challenges they faced on the ground were far from over. A cabin divided. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit as the plane soared over the Midwest, cruising at 35,000 feet. Inside the cabin, however, the tension that had simmered since the earlier confrontation was beginning to boil over. Captain Thomas Carter and First Officer Jackson Bryant worked in practiced unison, their focus on the instruments and the journey ahead. Yet the undercurrent of unease in the cabin was something neither could ignore for long. Thomas glanced at the intercom panel, considering whether to check in with the flight attendants. It wasn't standard practice to micromanage the cabin crew, but the earlier disturbance had clearly unsettled Sarah and her team. Jackson seemed to sense his thoughts and spoke up. "Want me to handle the next round of checks?" Jackson asked, his tone calm but measured. Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I'll step out and see how things are looking back there. You've got the con." With a quick glance at the autopilot settings, Thomas unbuckled his harness and stood, straightening his uniform. He opened the cockpit door and stepped into the galley where Sarah was waiting. Her usual professional demeanor was intact, but there was a tightness around her eyes that spoke of stress. "What's the situation?" Thomas asked quietly. Sarah sighed, leaning slightly against the counter. "The passenger from earlier hasn't let it go. He's not loud anymore, but he's stirring people up, dropping comments, making subtle jabs. A few others are starting to echo his concerns." Thomas frowned. "How many?" "Hard to say," Sarah admitted. "Maybe a dozen passengers are actively talking about it, but the energy is spreading. People who were indifferent at the start are now questioning why there's so much unrest." Thomas pinched the bridge of his nose. This wasn't just a disruptive passenger issue. It was becoming a broader problem of perception. Passengers who might have trusted the crew implicitly were now looking for reassurance where there had been none needed before. "Let's get ahead of this," Thomas said. "I'll address the cabin directly." Thomas made his way down the aisle, the hum of passenger conversations growing louder as he approached the middle of the economy section. The murmurs hushed slightly as he stopped and turned to face the cabin, his posture calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the ambient noise, "I'd like to take a moment to address some concerns I've been made aware of regarding this flight. My name is Captain Thomas Carter, and I am responsible for the safety and operation of this aircraft." All eyes turned toward him, some filled with curiosity, others tinged with doubt. Thomas let the silence hang for a moment, ensuring he had their attention. This flight, like every flight, is staffed by a highly trained and professional crew. First Officer Jackson Bryant, who is assisting me in the cockpit today, is one of the most competent pilots I've had the pleasure of working with. He has over 5,000 flight hours, extensive training, and a deep commitment to passenger safety. I trust him with this plane and with your lives as much as I trust myself. A few heads nodded, but Thomas could still see uncertainty in some faces. He pressed on, his tone firm but empathetic. I understand that flying can be a source of anxiety for many people. It's natural to seek reassurance when something feels unfamiliar or unexpected. But let me assure you, there is nothing unusual about the way this flight is being conducted. Your safety and comfort are our top priorities, and I ask for your cooperation in ensuring this remains a smooth journey for everyone on board. A smattering of applause broke out from the back of the cabin, led by a middle-aged woman wearing a teacher's conference lanyard. Her claps were firm and deliberate, as if daring others to disagree. Encouraged, a few more passengers joined in, their support rippling forward through the cabin. Thomas nodded, his gaze sweeping the rows of passengers. If anyone has further questions or concerns, I encourage you to address them with me directly after the flight. For now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the remainder of your journey. With that, he returned to the galley, where Sarah and Maria stood watching. Sarah gave him a small smile, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Well done, Captain," she said. "I think that helped." Back in the cockpit, Jackson glanced up as Thomas re-entered. "How'd it go?" "About as well as could be expected," Thomas replied, settling into his seat. "Most of the cabin seems reassured, but there are still a few holdouts." Jackson nodded, his focus returning to the controls. "It's always the few." Thomas wanted to say something more, to acknowledge the burden Jackson carried not just as a pilot, but as a black man in a profession still grappling with its own biases. But he knew Jackson didn't need platitudes. He needed support, respect, and partnership. "Just so you know," Thomas said after a moment, "I've got your back." Jackson didn't look up, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I appreciate that, Captain." The flight continued uneventfully for the next hour, the occasional turbulence over the plains causing a few gasps from nervous passengers, but nothing out of the ordinary. In the cabin, the earlier tension had mostly dissipated, though Thomas noticed Sarah passing through the aisles more frequently, her watchful eyes scanning for any signs of unrest. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, the intercom crackled to life. It was Sarah, her tone warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, we'd like to thank you for choosing us today. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, your trays are stowed, and your seats are in their upright positions. On behalf of Captain Carter, First Officer Bryant, and the entire crew, we wish you a pleasant stay in Atlanta or safe travels to your final destination." Thomas glanced at Jackson, who was guiding the plane through its descent with practiced ease. The young pilot's expression was calm, his hand steady on the controls as the Atlanta skyline came into view. "Landing checklist," Thomas said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "Landing gear down," Jackson replied, moving through the procedures with precision. As the plane touched down smoothly, the passengers erupted into a round of applause, a familiar tradition for nervous flyers, but one that carried extra meaning this time. Thomas allowed himself a small smile, proud not just of the flight's success, but of the way his crew had handled the challenges that arose. At the gate, as passengers disembarked, several stopped to thank the crew. The woman with the teacher's lanyard paused near the cockpit door, her expression earnest. "I just want to say," she began, her voice slightly trembling, "that young man you have as your co-pilot, he's a credit to your profession. And so are you, for standing by him." Thomas smiled, his voice warm. "Thank you for your kind words. We're lucky to have him." As Jackson stepped out of the cockpit, he was met with more thanks and even a few handshakes. It was a small but meaningful gesture, a reminder that while ignorance could be loud, respect and understanding could be louder. As the last passenger exited, Thomas turned to Jackson. "Tough day," he said, his tone light. Jackson nodded, a glimmer of humor in his eyes. "Nothing we couldn't handle." The two men shared a brief but genuine smile before turning their attention to the next flight ahead. The challenges of the day had tested them both, but they had emerged stronger, as pilots, as professionals, and as allies navigating a world that still had miles to go. Shadows of accountability. The Atlanta terminal was alive with the buzz of travelers rushing to make connections, but for Captain Thomas Carter and First Officer Jackson Bryant, the noise felt distant. They walked through the terminal side by side, their polished uniforms standing out amidst the sea of casual attire. The successful landing had been a relief, but both men knew the true turbulence of the day wasn't behind them. Whispers, lingering gazes, and subtle pauses in conversation followed them as they made their way toward the crew lounge. Jackson's face remained impassive, but Thomas could sense the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. As they entered the lounge, Sarah and Maria were already there, engaged in a hushed conversation with Monica, the operations manager. Monica's sharp eyes turned toward the two pilots as they entered. "Captain Carter, First Officer Bryant," Monica greeted them, her voice measured. "I've been briefed on the situation during the flight." Thomas exchanged a glance with Jackson. "We managed to resolve the issue on board," Thomas said, keeping his tone professional. "But I suspect there's more to address." Monica gestured for them to sit. "Unfortunately, yes. Several passengers filed complaints after landing. Some were directed at the disruptive passenger, but others were about the situation as a whole." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What kind of complaints?" Monica sighed, pulling up a tablet. "Passengers are questioning the decision to keep a passenger who was openly stirring up doubts about the crew. Some feel it should have been handled more assertively, removing the individual, for example." Jackson leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "So let me get this straight. They're upset we didn't escalate the situation in flight and cause a bigger disturbance." "Essentially, yes," Monica admitted. "But there's another layer to this. Social media." She tapped her tablet, showing them a video that had already garnered thousands of views. It was footage from the flight, shot by a passenger, capturing the disruptive man's comments and Thomas's public address. The comments section was a maelstrom of mixed opinions, some commending the crew's professionalism, others questioning why the situation arose in the first place. "This is going viral," Monica said grimly. "We've already had reporters reaching out for statements, and corporate has taken notice." Thomas leaned back, his mind racing. While the video portrayed him as calm and commanding, the underlying narrative was a double-edged sword. For some, it showcased leadership and professionalism in the face of adversity. For others, it was a stark reminder of lingering prejudices within the industry. "Do we know if the passenger in question has filed any complaints?" Thomas asked. Monica shook her head. "Not yet, but given his demeanor, I wouldn't rule it out. Corporate's concern is about the broader perception. They want us to provide detailed reports before the end of the day." Thomas nodded. "Understood." Monica turned to Jackson. "First Officer Bryant, I'd like to hear your perspective on the situation. Corporate will be reviewing all crew statements." Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "The situation began with a single passenger questioning my qualifications based solely on my appearance. Captain Carter handled it appropriately, prioritizing the safety and comfort of all passengers. Any further escalation would have jeopardized that balance." His words were measured, his tone unwavering. Monica nodded, typing notes into her tablet. "Thank you. I'll make sure that's included." As Monica left to compile her report, the room fell into a contemplative silence. Sarah and Maria lingered nearby, their expressions filled with unspoken concern. It was Maria who broke the quiet. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You both handled the situation with professionalism, and now it's being spun into something ugly." Jackson gave her a small, reassuring smile. It comes with the territory. No, it doesn't, Sarah interjected, her tone sharper. Or at least, it shouldn't. People like him, she gestured toward Jackson, shouldn't have to carry the weight of everyone's biases on top of doing their jobs. Thomas placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. We'll address it, he said firmly. But right now, we need to stay focused on the facts. The last thing we need is for emotion to cloud the issue. Later that afternoon, Thomas and Jackson sat together in the crew lounge, drafting their official reports. As they worked, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on how the day had unfolded. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered ignorance or bias in his career, but seeing it directed so blatantly at Jackson had struck a nerve. Jackson, for his part, remained calm and methodical, his words precise and professional as he documented the events. "I've got to ask," Thomas said after a moment, breaking the silence. "How do you deal with it?" Jackson paused, setting down his pen. "With what?" "This," Thomas said, gesturing vaguely. "The assumptions, the second-guessing, the scrutiny." Jackson leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "You learn to compartmentalize. Focus on the work, the craft. There are always going to be people who doubt you, who question your place. But at the end of the day, it's not about them. It's about proving to yourself that you belong." Thomas nodded, impressed by the younger pilot's resilience. "Still, it shouldn't have to be that way." "No," Jackson agreed, "but it is. And every time we handle it with grace and professionalism, we make it a little easier for the next person." As the hours passed, the day's events began to take on a life of their own. News outlets picked up the viral video, framing it as a story of resilience and professionalism in the face of discrimination. The airline released a carefully worded statement praising the crew's handling of the situation, while reaffirming its commitment to diversity and inclusion. For Thomas and Jackson, however, the accolades felt hollow. The real work lay ahead, changing not just the narrative, but the culture that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the terminal in a warm orange glow, Thomas and Jackson prepared for their final flight of the day. The tension that had marked the earlier flight still lingered, but there was also a renewed sense of determination between them. "Ready to do it all over again?" Thomas asked, a wry smile on his face. "Always," Jackson replied, his tone light, but resolute. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, their uniforms gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, Thomas couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, not just for his own work, but for the quiet strength Jackson brought to the job. Together, they were more than pilots. They were symbols of what professionalism, respect, and perseverance could achieve, even in the face of adversity. The sky awaited, and with it, the endless possibilities of a better tomorrow. Skyward resolve. The terminal was quiet as the final passengers boarded the red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle. The earlier commotion seemed like a distant memory now, though its ripples could still be felt in the sharp glances from the ground crew and the whispers among the gate agents. For Captain Thomas Carter and First Officer Jackson Bryant, this final flight of the day was more than just a job. It was an opportunity to reclaim their focus and remind themselves of why they took to the skies in the first place. Thomas adjusted his uniform as he settled into the captain's seat, glancing at Jackson, who was already running through the pre-flight checklist with the same quiet efficiency he'd exhibited all day. The younger pilot's demeanor was calm, his movements deliberate. If the day's challenges weighed on him, he didn't show it. "You good?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Jackson nodded, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. "Always." Thomas smiled faintly, appreciating Jackson's resolve. It was a reminder of why he'd chosen this career, why they both had. Flying wasn't just about mastering the mechanics of an aircraft. It was about navigating challenges with grace, both in the air and on the ground. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Thomas felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came with every takeoff. It was a moment of pure focus, where all the noise and chaos of the world faded away, replaced by the singular task of defying gravity. Jackson guided the plane into position, his hands steady on the controls. "Ready when you are, Captain," Jackson said, his voice steady. "Let's take her up," Thomas replied. The engines roared to life, the powerful thrust pressing them back into their seats as the plane surged down the runway. Moments later, the aircraft lifted into the sky, the lights of Atlanta receding into the darkness below. The transition from ground to air was seamless, a testament to their shared expertise. "Positive rate," Jackson announced. "Gear up," Thomas confirmed. As the plane climbed toward cruising altitude, the cockpit fell into a comfortable rhythm. For the first time that day, Thomas allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing as the plane leveled off. "Cruise altitude reached," Jackson said, his voice breaking the silence. "Nice work," Thomas replied, his tone warm. "Let's keep it steady." Hours into the flight, as the plane soared over the Midwest under a blanket of stars, Thomas leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting. The events of the day had been a stark reminder of the challenges they still faced, even in a profession that demanded the utmost precision and professionalism. Yet, despite the frustration and fatigue, Thomas felt a deep sense of pride, not just in himself, but in Jackson and the entire crew. "You ever think about why you started flying?" Thomas asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Jackson glanced at him, a hint of curiosity in his expression. "All the time," he said. "It's what keeps me going." "What was it for you?" Thomas pressed, genuinely interested. Jackson smiled faintly, his gaze shifting to the stars outside the cockpit window. "My grandfather," he said after a moment. "He was a Tuskegee Airman. He used to tell me stories about flying, about how it felt to break through the clouds and leave everything else behind. I wanted to feel that freedom, to see the world the way he did." Thomas nodded, a surge of respect washing over him. "Sounds like he was an incredible man." "He was," Jackson said, his voice tinged with emotion. "And he taught me that flying wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey. About proving to yourself that you can rise above whatever's holding you down." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Thomas. He thought about his own journey, the long hours of training, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, and how those experiences had shaped him. "You've got that same spirit," Thomas said quietly. "Your grandfather would be proud." Jackson's smile deepened, and for a moment, the weight of the day seemed to lift. As the plane continued its journey westward, the cabin settled into the quiet routine of a red-eye flight. Passengers dozed in their seats, the soft glow of reading lights punctuating the darkness. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, their voices low as they offered drinks and blankets to those still awake. In the cockpit, Thomas and Jackson worked in harmonious silence, their movements synchronized as they monitored the aircraft's systems. The hum of the engines was a comforting presence, a reminder of the power and precision that kept them aloft. But the stillness was interrupted when the intercom crackled to life, Sarah's voice cutting through the quiet. "Captain, we have a situation in the cabin." Thomas and Jackson exchanged a glance, their instincts kicking in. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice calm. "There's a passenger in the economy cabin causing a disturbance," Sarah replied. "He's demanding to speak to you." Thomas sighed, unbuckling his harness. "I'll handle it," he said, standing. "You want backup?" Jackson asked, his tone light, but serious. Thomas chuckled softly. "I think I can manage. Keep us steady." As Thomas entered the cabin, he immediately identified the source of the commotion. A man seated near the middle of the plane, his voice loud and aggressive. Several passengers were glancing his way, their expressions a mix of annoyance and concern. "What seems to be the problem?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but firm as he approached. The man turned, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the captain. "The problem is your co-pilot," he said loudly. "I don't feel safe knowing someone like that is flying this plane." The words hung in the air like a slap, and Thomas felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. But he kept his expression neutral, his tone measured. "Sir, I assure you, First Officer Bryant is a highly trained and experienced pilot. Your safety has never been in question." The man scoffed, crossing his arms. "That's easy for you to say, but I've got a right to know who's flying this plane." "And you do know," Thomas replied. "You're flying with two professionals who are fully qualified and dedicated to your safety. If that's not enough for you, I suggest you file a formal complaint after the flight." The man opened his mouth to argue, but Thomas raised a hand, cutting him off. "For now, I ask that you remain seated and respectful to your fellow passengers. Any further disruptions will not be tolerated." A ripple of approval spread through the cabin, and several passengers nodded in agreement. The man, clearly outnumbered, sank back into his seat, grumbling under his breath. As Thomas made his way back to the cockpit, he felt a sense of satisfaction. The day had been filled with challenges, but each one had been met with professionalism and resolve. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the first hints of dawn painted the horizon in shades of pink and gold. The city's lights sparkled below, a welcome sight after a long and trying day. "Landing checklist," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Landing gear down," Jackson replied, moving through the procedures with precision. The aircraft touched down smoothly, eliciting a round of applause from the passengers. As the plane taxied to the gate, Thomas glanced at Jackson, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "You handled today like a pro," Thomas said, his tone warm. Jackson smiled, his hand steady on the controls. "Just doing my job, Captain." As they disembarked, the crew was met with a mix of smiles and gratitude from the passengers. Many stopped to thank them personally, their words a reminder of why they chose this profession. For Thomas and Jackson, the day had been more than just a series of flights. It had been a testament to their resilience, their professionalism, and their unwavering commitment to rise above the clouds, both literal and metaphorical. Together, they had navigated not just the skies, but the challenges that came with them, proving that dignity and excellence could always prevail. The sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the airport as they prepared for their next journey. And though the road ahead was long, they were ready to face it, one flight at a time.